Hello. I'm going to talk to you now about the Potsdam Conference, which is the third of the three conferences held by the Grand Alliance of wartime leaders, the Allies, that's Britain, America and Russia. You'll remember from previous episodes of this, there had been two previous conferences, 1943, Tehran, and February 1945, Yalta. Now this is the third and final conference between the wartime leaders on the Allied side, and they're basically trying to work out what to do with Germany, because the war is effectively over. Remember that some key changes had occurred between Yalta and Potsdam. Notably, the American leader Roosevelt had died and replaced by Truman, who was very anti-communist and very distrustful of Stalin. Excuse me. In halfway through the Potsdam Conference, the British leader Churchill lost the general election, and was replaced by Clement Attlee. If you need a little bit more information about this, can I suggest you watch the end of the previous episode of this about Yalta. It's very clear. There are 6 changes. So, getting back to Potsdam. The aim? To decide what to do with Germany. There are various points of agreement. In fact, there are 7 points of agreement at the Potsdam Conference. The first is they agree they're still going to divide Germany up, like they'd agreed at Yalta. People often get a little bit confused, which one was it, Yalta or Potsdam, where they agreed to do it. They did it at both. Secondly, they agreed to demilitarize Germany. That means to disband their armed forces to prevent Germany ever attacking anyone again and causing another war. The third thing is they're going to re-establish democracy in Germany. Now, Germany had been a Nazi dictatorship. There were no elections after 1933, and basically the Allies agreed they're going to have free elections in Germany, freedom of speech and the freedom of press. The fourth point is about reparations. Now, reparations is money paid by the loser of a war to repair the damage caused by the war. You may remember this from Year 9 history of the Treaty of Versailles, the £6.6 billion worth of reparations that Germany had to pay to the Allies because of the First World War. Now, what was agreed at Potsdam was that Russia would receive reparations, but not cash. It was going to receive goods, equipment and materials from Germany, not money at all. This was going to go to Russia because Russia had suffered the most in the Second World War. I mean, horrific stuff happened out there. Over 20 million Russians had died in the Second World War, and the Soviet Union was going to get 1/4 of all the industrial goods made in the western zones of Germany, and in return they were going to provide some food and stuff for the western sectors. And the fifth part is they agreed to ban the Nazi Party. And they were going to have trials of Nazi war criminals that would be held at Nuremberg in 1946. The sixth point, again very much linked to Yalta, is that they agreed to fully participate in the United Nations. And the final point is that the Polish frontier, which remember at Yalta Stalin had wanted to move further towards the west, so Poland was made slightly bigger, was indeed going to be moved westwards. They agreed that. So quite a lot of points of agreement, really, 7 of them, many of them reiterating what had been agreed at Yalta, but some new ones as well. However, there are 2 very important differences or disagreements. One, the question of what to do with Germany, and this is really important when you understand why there are problems in Berlin in particular. Bearing in mind that 20 million Russians had died during the Second World War, Stalin wanted a huge amount of compensation from Germany because he wanted to ensure that Germany was absolutely crippled, so it could never be in a position to attack Russia again. Bear in mind, Russia's been attacked twice in 30 years, 1914 and 1941. So it's got a point here. It just wants to make sure it's completely safe, and the easiest way of doing that is basically by crippling Germany completely. The thing is, though, Britain and America don't really want to cripple Germany because they think, being good historians, they've realised that actually we did it in 1918, at the end of the First World War. You know, the Treaty of Versailles was very, very harsh. And what happened? The Second World War. So if we repeat that mistake, we could end up with a Third World War, and no one wants that. Plus, if Britain and America cripple Germany, they're going to have to pay for the Germans in their sectors. What Britain and America want is Germany to be self-sufficient. So it might not have an army, so it might not be a threat, but it's paying for itself. It's not a drain. And bearing in mind that the British economy is fairly rubbish at the end of the Second World War, the last thing the British can afford to do is pay for Germany as well. So that's the first point of disagreement, reparations. And the second point of disagreement is about free elections. Now, Truman wanted free elections in Eastern European countries, particularly those ones that had been occupied by Soviet forces. And essentially what happened was the Germans had invaded Russia, pushed the Russians back, and then the Russians fought back and pushed the Germans all the way back into Germany. And in each of the countries the Russians passed through on the way, they left a few troops there to keep control. And what Truman wanted was free elections in those countries. Stalin did not want American interference in those Eastern European countries. And he was very anti-free elections in these countries for various reasons. He really does want to create a buffer zone of friendly satellite states. And in the next episode or two, I'll talk to you about Soviet expansion. Just bear this in mind then. But the key thing is, at the end of the Potsdam Conference, Truman is getting a little bit fed up with Stalin, and he starts a get-tough approach with Russia. And this very much links to the Truman Doctrine and martial aid, and it's also linked to the Soviet actions with Soviet expansion. Now, the key thing about the Potsdam Conference is this is the point where the wartime alliances break apart, and we really get a Cold War between these former allies, Russia and America, and they're fighting away, competing for control of Eastern Europe, or domination, or spreading their ideas, containing the spread of communism. And it starts with the Potsdam Conference. This is the breakdown. Okay, so I hope that makes sense, bearing in mind that with each of these conferences there are points of agreement on one hand and points of disagreement on the other. Just make sure you're familiar with those. Okay, thank you. Right, Nazi Germany. One of the questions that comes up very commonly is about the Nazi dictatorship. How did Hitler establish a dictatorship or totalitarian control, which means absolute control over Germany? Now, remember that Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933, January 1933. Now, initially, he didn't have a great deal of power or control. Remember, the Nazis were a minority in the cabinet. Von Papen expected to be able to control Hitler. However, by 1934, Hitler had established a one-party dictatorship in Germany. The question is, how did he do this? Now, on the face of it, it looks to be quite difficult because it's such a big question, but that actually makes it easy. There are lots of very simple things that you need to remember. And if you do this chronologically, it's very easy. So, 1. Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933. Now, the first thing he wants to do is to get rid of opposition. Now, Hitler's greatest threat, or potential threat, in terms of power, was the Communists. They were the second most popular party in Nazi Germany. So, that's the first people that Hitler needs to get rid of. Now, what Hitler did was he called for an election on the 5th of March 1933 because he wanted a complete majority in Germany. Remember, he'd said earlier to the Nazi party after the failed Munich putsch, we must hold our noses and enter the Reichstag. This is part of how he's going to do that. So, calls an election in March. Now, fortunately for Hitler, or unfortunately for everybody else, in February the 27th, 1933, there was a fire at the Reichstag building. Now, there's a lot of debate over who did this. Actually, it doesn't really matter to us who did it. What matters is how Hitler used it. Now, the fire started in the Reichstag, which is the German parliament, and it burnt it down. Now, a Dutch communist, Van der Lubbe, L-U-B-B-E, was discovered there and fessed up. Unfortunately, he was a sort of a lunatic and slightly deranged, but he accepted responsibility for this. Now, doesn't matter whether he did it or not, doesn't matter whether the Nazis did it and blamed it on the communists. What matters is that Hitler used it as an excuse. Right? And he used it as an excuse to try and attack the communists. Now, straight after this, Hindenburg declared a state of emergency. That's the first thing. You have to use that phrase, state of emergency. And he gave Hitler the power to rule by decree, which means he didn't have to go to the Reichstag anymore. He could just make a law or make a decision. And Hitler's first thing he did was arrest 4,000 communists, blaming them for the Reichstag fire. Now, he calls for a new election in March 1933, but he also passes the Decree for the Protection of the People and the State. The Decree for the Protection of the People and the State. If you can say that in your exam, it makes you look so clever. All right? It's worth learning that one. Now, what that did was it suspended all civil rights in Germany. That means all the rights for people that they have enshrined in law, their protection. Now, what he did was he imprisoned political opposition and he banned the communist newspapers. But also, it gave him the control of the police. That's very, very important, bearing in mind a week later there's going to be an election. And he told the police and the courts to turn a blind eye to the SA. And meanwhile, the SA were out beating up communists and breaking up their meetings and basically damaging the communist chances in the March election. In addition to this, elections are very, very, very expensive, and Hitler needed cash. So what he did was he had various meetings with top industrialists, the main one being the Krupps company. And they agreed to finance the Nazi party, which gave Hitler loads of cash to spend on elections, which made he could get his message out even more. In one meeting alone, those financiers offered him 3 million marks in one meeting. Now, the election of March 1933 was actually a bloody election. There were 70 deaths. Okay? And a lot of these were caused by the SA and the communists fighting each other. Remember, both had private armies. Now, in the election, the Nazis won 288 seats. This is their biggest election victory by far, but it's still not a majority. Okay, still wasn't. So, what Hitler did was he used his emergency powers to ban the Communist Party from taking up their 81 seats. Now, what that meant was that Hitler, with his allies, some nationalists, small nationalist parties, Hitler had a 2/3 majority in the Reichstag. Now, that meant he could legally change the constitution. Now, the constitution are the rules that govern how a country is run. So, what he did is really important. It's called the Enabling Act. Now, the 23rd of March 1933, Hitler passed the Enabling Act. Now, more formally, it's known as the Law for the Removal of the Distress of the People and the Reich. The Law for the Removal of the Distress of the People and the Reich. Now, the fact that I'm looking at my notes to try to remember that shows you, actually, if you call it the Enabling Act, it's fine. You don't need to know that big posh expression. But if you do, you get some good marks. Now, what the Enabling Act enabled Hitler to do was to rule for 4 years without the Reichstag. He could make any law he wanted. Now, you're probably thinking, hang on, why did the Reichstag vote for themselves not to have any power? It's very simple. Hitler had a majority. Plus, all the other guys in the Reichstag were intimidated. Hitler stationed the SS, his bodyguards, the guys in the black uniforms, on all the corridors. And they stood there all stern-faced and looking really threatening. And the message was very simple. Don't mess with us. We're going to cause problems for you. You don't want to vote against this. And outside, Hitler had all the SA shouting, you know, come on, give us the Enabling Act, give us the Enabling Act, or you're going to get blood and murder, and it's going to be carnage. So all the people inside the Reichstag that weren't Nazis or nationalists started thinking, need to be kind of careful here. And as a consequence of Hitler and the nationalists and the intimidation by the SS and the SA, the Enabling Act was passed by 444 votes to 94. Now, so what Hitler's now got is the ability to rule without parliament. He's a dictator. But he's still got opposition that threaten him. And the biggest opposition to Hitler are the trade unions. Bearing in mind he's banned the Communist Party already. The next place where communists are most commonly found is within the trade unions. Now, they represent the interests and the rights of the workers. And the workers traditionally tended to support the communists in Nazi Germany. In Germany, sorry. And the communists dominated the trade unions. And trade unions had the power to strike. And if all the workers went on strike, it could cause some major problems for Germany. So Hitler, in May 1933, banned trade unions. made strikes illegal. So there's no Communist Party, and there's no trade unions, and there's no strikes. So Hitler's got rid of one of the greatest threats to him. Now in July he goes a stage further, and he decrees that all political parties, except the Nazis or the NSDAP, all political parties are illegal. Now basically, the leaders of all the other political parties were either arrested or fled abroad. The clever ones fled, because the guys that were arrested were sent to the very first concentration camp. And that was Dachau, D-A-C-H-A-U, Dachau. Set up in 1933 for political opponents. Please don't confuse that with an extermination camp, such as Auschwitz. A concentration camp is merely somewhere where large numbers of prisoners are concentrated in one area. Okay? So he banned all the political parties, and then in January 1934 he went a stage further. Now in Germany you had the Reichstag that controlled the majority of Germany, but inside Germany there were 18 Länder. Now I'm probably pronouncing that awfully. In fact, I'm definitely pronouncing it awfully. L-A-N-D-E-R. Now that's regions. There were 18 regions in Germany, and they each had their own little parliament. Now that's a potential threat to Hitler. He didn't control them. So what he did, funnily enough, is he banned them. And he abolished all the Länder, and he appointed 18 Nazi governors to control each of the regions of Germany. Now, this is very, very important, because by January 1934, Hitler's got rid of political opponents, opposition parties, trade unions, and local government. The Nazis are in power. Okay? Now, there's a lot of information there, but very simply, just remember, January, Hitler comes to power. February, there's a fire, which Hitler uses to ban the opposition and pass emergency powers. In the election, he uses those emergency powers to gain a large majority of people of support. Once he's got that support and the support of the nationalists as well, he passes the Enabling Act, number 4. He passes the Enabling Act, and then in May he bans trade unions using the Enabling Act. In July he bans political parties, and in January 1934 he abolishes the Länder. Okay? Now it stems from two things: the emergency powers he's given to first of all, and the Enabling Act. Now, most common mistake is that most people get those two things mixed up. Don't. The emergency powers comes first, and then the Enabling Act. All right? Hope that makes sense. If I was you, I would do this as a flow diagram to make sense of it all and see how it all slots together. All right? I would rewind this. I would use your textbook, use your revision books and your student workbooks, anything like that to help you. Hope that's been of some help.